Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to knowledge and research on the evolution and new frontiers of multilateralism. And in this episode, we're joined by Daniel Laqua, Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Northumbria University in the UK, by Dan Gorman, who is Professor of History at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and Anne-Isabelle Richard, who is University Lecturer at the Institute for History at Leiden University. They're involved in an international research project entitled Global Governance, Trust and Democratic Engagement in Past and Present, or more prosaically, GLOW. And it is run in the framework of the Transatlantic Platform for the Social Sciences and Humanities. It's a project that examines how people have campaigned to create and reform, transform, or abolish international organizations, and how NGOs and social movements have tried to work through them from the aftermath of the First World War to the early 2000s. And we're catching them just prior to a very fascinating conference to be held at the Graduate Institute on Love, Hate and Fate in the International Organizations. So, GLOW explores a timely question about what happens when people trust, doubt, support, resist, or try and reshape international organizations. And it feels especially relevant in a period marked by debates over globalism, legitimacy, and cooperation. So welcome all three of you to the podcast. And I wanted to start with just asking you what brought you together in GLOW. Why did this feel like the right moment to tackle this problem?
Well, I think I should say, first of all, that it's not just the three of us. We're but a small group within the wider GLOW team, because altogether, GLOW brings together around 15 different researchers. We are funded, as you've said, within something called the Transatlantic Platform, which is a mechanism by which research councils from different countries cooperate. And in our case, we're funded by research councils from Canada, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. So you'll hear a little bit from the three of us, but obviously there are other colleagues, including the colleagues at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, who are organizing the conference. And they're not here right now because they're busy organizing the event itself. But what brought us together was the question of how do international organizations relate to the people as actors, as an imagined constituency. And that broader research question raises another question, namely the relationship between democracy and global governance. Often international organizations get criticized for lack of democracy, for not being sufficiently representative. And so that might be seen as a democratic critique of international organizations. But we're also thinking about a very important category, and that's quite central to the set of research questions that we're reflecting on, namely trust. Now, mistrust can also be a democratic impulse. It's often quite good to be critical and not to take everything for granted that people in authority say. But of course, mistrust can also undermine the efforts for international cooperation, which are important for tackling global challenges. But we think that this kind of category of trust can be quite useful for probing that relationship between international organizations, global governance institutions, and actors from within civil society. Does that summarize it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we're looking at cases, or the members of the team are looking at cases that span about 100 years, from the late 19th, early 20th century to the early 21st century. One of our colleagues is looking at Jubilee 2000, for instance, and we've got other people who are looking at certainly the League of Nations, but even some of the early international, what we would today call international non-governmental organizations, like the Red Cross in the pre-First World War era. So if you think about that 100-odd year span of the history of international organizations, we're looking at a single category of bodies that are actually very different in all kinds of different ways. Truly international organizations made up of member states and so forth and so on. We're at the UN here, but also civil society organizations and lots of other international bodies that are organized in different ways, but either work together with formal international organizations or, as is often the case, in opposition to those bodies.
But you were going right up, the research is going up to very recent times, the early 2000s. And we were just saying, Anne-Isabelle, that it seems just a moment ago, really. What was the cutoff point for you?
I don't know. I guess the cutoff point, I guess we're always looking for the implications of our research also in the present. So there is always more of a fluid boundary. So even, my work and Dan's work, and both Daniel's works, has been on the interwar period. And I think there are a lot of connections to draw out to the present. And the same goes for the Jubilee work. So I guess it is always a sort of discussion between the present and more historical work.
And so you're also looking at the way there were campaigns to reform international organizations, but also the way civil society uses them. Why these two dynamics?
I think it's a myth to separate them. I think that's the most basic answer. I think international organizations from the League on, and even before that, the example of the Red Cross perhaps is also a good example. They have always operated in dialogue, sometimes more friendly than at other times, with civil society organizations. And they embody this same international society, I guess you could call it. So it would be a myth to separate them and to suggest that they work in different fields. They are in conversation together.
That makes sense. Daniel, your work really focuses very much on global governance and international civil society. How do you see recurring patterns in the way people have tried to make the institutions more legitimate?
Well, I think it's important to start off by saying that we cannot completely separate the two from one another, because the kinds of bodies that we associate with global governance, namely various international institutions, they are often the product of efforts from within civil society. A body such as the League of Nations is the result of many different people at different places having pushed for the creation of a wider international organization. And then even the evolving agenda of the League of Nations also emerged out of a dialogue with what we now call civil society. And something similar can be said about many other organizations, the organizations that make up the UN system, whether they're humanitarian nature or educational nature. Often they evolved out of the interplay with various groups. And this is important because of the question that you're pointing at, namely questions of the legitimacy of international organizations. Often the groups, whether they're feminist campaigners, humanitarian activists, pacifists, socialists, that had been involved in debates about how to shape particular international organizations, often they concluded that the organizations as they had emerged did not quite fulfill their potential. They did not quite amount to what people had hoped they would. But rather than rejecting them altogether, they engaged in various campaigns to maybe shift the actions or transform these organizations to some extent in order to make them closer to the vision that these particular groups pursued. So that's quite important. That's a question about legitimacy. But it does mean that when we think about the history of global governance, it is something that we cannot simply study through the prism of diplomats and UN conferences, but actually we need to think about these different groups and campaigners and how they tried to put pressure on the organizations and the people who decided the future of those organizations.
I hope we're going to talk a bit more closely about how you do that later. So Anne-Isabelle, your research focused also on transnational and trans-imperial history as well as civil society. How does that perspective reshape the way we think about international organizations?
I think maybe just to pick up what Dan was saying, and I think to use the example of the European Union could be a useful way to think about this, because when we talk about the EU, people might think, okay, since when do we have the EU? Well, the Treaty of Maastricht, but before that, it all started with the coal and steel community. Basically, on the 9th of May, 1950, Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, woke up, had a brilliant idea, and then everybody fell in line, just like that. And that's not how it worked. That 9th of May speech was sort of one of the highlights in a much longer process, and the signing of the Treaty of the Coal and Steel Community was yet another marking point. And, then the rest is history that comes after. But what comes before, I think if you move away from looking at just states and taking the nation state as the entity, so like moving away from methodological nationalism, you actually see that there is a lot that came before Robert Schuman waking up on the 9th of May and having that brilliant idea, and that there were lots of organizations and people and activists who thought that the nation state didn't have the answers to the problems that their societies were facing, and that connecting to people in other nation states to create something that went beyond the nation state was a way to address these questions. And this brings us to the interwar period. And basically, I would argue that if we want to understand why we have a European Union, we need to understand what happened after the First World War. And it's in that interplay between civil society, diplomatic actors, but very much adopting a perspective beyond the nation state that you actually get to see that.
And so, Dan, your scholarship is on the British Empire and modern global governance, and you pay close attention to internationalism, but political belonging. We're getting closer to emotions here, I think. So what does history reveal about who felt represented by global institutions and who didn't?
That's, I think, one of the key questions that a lot of our colleagues on the project are also interested in, whether they articulate it explicitly along those lines or not. I mean, again, if we think about the 100-odd years of history of international organizations that the project is looking at from the late 19th century until the turn of the 21st century, and we think about how international organizations have evolved over that time, we can start to map the emergence of international institutions onto the historical context out of which they come. So whether that's an interwar period where people are looking back to a First World War and at least partly constructing international organizations with the goal of preventing they fail on these lines specifically, but of preventing another global conflict. But if we think about international organizations and questions of belonging and so forth, and think about questions of empire, so there's been a lot of historians, I think this argument is somewhat overdetermined, but who have argued that, say, the United Nations has emerged from or emerged from the structures and the sort of raison d'etre of the British Empire. Now, there were lots of other people invested in the UN who were not Jan Smuts or whomever, but nonetheless, we can look at empires in a world of empires until 1947, when India and Pakistan become independent states. There's far more people living in empires than there are living in nation states. So what political scientists talk about is the Westphalian moment, this world of nation states and so forth. If we want to think sort of in literal historical terms about a Westphalian world, if such a thing has ever existed, it's only existed in the last 50-odd years, whereas the history of international organizations, certainly in the way that we understand them today, dates back to the 19th century. If we broaden our understanding or definition of international organizations, of course, much farther. But some of those initial international organizations, some of which are emerging out of empire in the late 19th century, many of them are functional bodies. So the what was then the International Telegraph Union, the Telecommunications Union, today our oldest, still existing international organization, if we define along those lines, is a functional body. And a lot of those bodies in the pre-First World War era were functional bodies. So this idea of belonging, especially political belonging to a functional body, was almost beside the point. But by the time we get to certainly the League, but also some of the other imperial institutions, so just in the British context, but there are parallels in other European empires, certainly, this idea of an empire itself as a proto-international organization is something that people within British imperial circles in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s started to sort of use that language, whether they're doing so cynically or for other reasons, as an aside. But this idea that empires are international institutions in and of themselves starts to fuse all of the often separate and disparate purposes international organizations have formed to pursue. And in the British context specifically, because unlike in France or the United States, which are republics and therefore have formal citizenship, nobody's a citizen of the British Empire. They're subjects. So what this meant in practice was often not that much different than formal citizenship. But it opened up lots of scope for people who shared the status of British subject within the British Empire to seek rights and, in fact, to claim belonging to an institution that they couldn't otherwise. So I can give you a quick example from Canada, just down the road from where I live and work, in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations. Well known here in Geneva, the Six Nations chief, Descahay, came here in 1923 to press his people's claims for rights that the Canadian government would not acknowledge. So this idea that you would go to Geneva, where none of these people had ever been, perhaps couldn't even find on a map, and make a claim to this then brand new international institution with the idea that it had some sense of legitimacy that could, in this particular case, shame, but sort of influence or shape what a national government, and a national government in those days, which was still a member of a British Empire and as yet had not gained control over its own foreign relations. So you've got sort of a set of Russian dolls here that, again, the emergence of international institutions created these dynamics of political belonging that did not exist in earlier eras.
That's really fascinating. Yes, and it's interesting to see those documents in the archives. Let's move on to the conference that you're about to attend, because it's got such a striking title, Love and Hate and the Fate of International Organizations. What does such emotional language help us see that we would miss?
Well, maybe to start with, we think about international organizations, but they are comprised of people. People make these organizations, and people have emotions. And there is a very interesting dynamic, which you see in, I think, many contexts. And the League of Nations was also very much at pains to emphasize that. And it may go actually back to what you were saying, Dan, about the International Telegraph Union, the sort of professionalization. And that these are places where emotions do not play a role. And there is this pretense that they don't play a role. But clearly they do, because they're human beings, and people get annoyed at each other, if anything, or they like each other, and that helps cooperating. And that's not even thinking about other contexts where, you were talking earlier about the Human Rights Committee. I've been where a lot of very difficult situations were described. I've been looking at the 1950s and 60s and looking at Dutch academics who were interned in Japanese internment camps. These things happened. These things did something to people and also influenced the way they looked at each other. But still, there is a pretense that we need to be professional, and that tension, I think, is brought to light when you think about this language.
Of course. It also has a sort of psychological frame, and concepts such as projection and transference enter into this conference. How do these concepts deepen our understanding of global governance? Dan?
I realize both of us are called Daniel.
I should distinguish, yes, Daniel.
No. It's I just want to, before answering this question, I just want to give a shout out to the colleagues in Geneva who've really framed conference, because that idea also about the psychic lives of international organizations is very much the work of the three colleagues who've conceived this event: Caroline Biltoft, Amalia Ribi-Forklat, and Thomas Gidney. So really the framing has been done by them. But I think it's a very important set of questions and a very stimulating one. Often people study international organizations in terms of what they do or what they set out to do. But thinking about the emotional and psychological side of things allows us to reflect on what they could do, how their actions were perceived, how people responded to these actions. And of course, we know that kind of perceptions and responses can be just as important for the outcome as intentions and then the actions themselves. So I think this is really important. And the framing that has been adopted for this event, as you have indicated, uses psychological concepts such as projection and transference. Now, I'm not a specialist in psychology, but it is quite fruitful to think about how these concepts might apply to international organizations. So as I understand it, transference describes the process by which we take something from a past relationship and transfer it onto someone else. So in other words, our past experiences, and that could include past traumas, affect how we think about some entity, some person that we're engaging with now. And that can be quite relevant when we think about the international realm. So just a moment ago, the other Dan has spoken about the British Empire in particular and imperial relationships. And it's quite clear that for groups of people as well as for individuals, experiences of imperial domination, for instance, or experiences of how the nation state, to mention yet another relationship, responded to someone and shaped someone or oppressed someone. These kinds of experiences could potentially shape the expectations of and responses to a body such as the United Nations. So these kinds of past experiences are not completely detached from how people or groups of people, organizations, actors may have perceived what particular UN ventures were trying to do. And that may in turn have actually created hostility to or support for these organizations. And projection is something similar, of course. It's a psychological concept that normally applies to an interpersonal relationship. I might project something onto you, and often maybe also some quite negative characteristics that I don't want to recognize in myself, but I seem to recognize them in you. But that is also something that we can see, and that is highly relevant from processes where we think about, for instance, hostility to internationalism, where we think about how mistrust can pose obstacles. And sometimes this might reflect more on the subconscious self-conception of the actors themselves. If you feel that someone is having ulterior motives, that they're trying to use the international realm in order to get back to you or so, that might actually also say something about your own attitudes. So understanding this and uncovering this is actually quite crucial. And it's not just something that is historically important, but it might also allow us to better understand some of the dilemmas faced when we think about international cooperation in the present world.
Interesting point. So Dan, the other Dan, would you like to give us an example of where emotions have shaped that support or opposition for an international organization?
Well, maybe I can speak a little bit about what I'll speak about tomorrow. That is the entity of United Nations associations. So these, under a different name, as Anne-Isabelle has written about, League of Nations societies predate the UN. So there's already a template for how such organizations could, can, should, might work. But I've looked at United Nations associations in the Anglo-American world, so in the UK, in the United States, and in Canada, and thinking about what types of emotional connections people who have voluntarily joined, so the committed, or like in a lot of civil society bodies, a periphery of people who have very sort of perhaps shallow or transitory connections with such bodies. But what does it mean to actually be a member of an association whose whole purpose is to support an international organization, or in this particular case, a family of international organizations? So why do people do this beyond supporting, political parties in their own states that might have an internationalist orientation or what have you? So this is not my formulation, but we can look at United Nations associations as sort of the second and a half UN. So the UN scholar Tom Weiss talks about the third UN, this whole sort of panoply of civil society bodies and think tanks and so forth and so on, which a lot of people in our project are looking at. but a so-called third UN that is providing the UN not just with support, including emotional support and legitimacy, because of course, unlike a nation state, international organizations do not have a built-in constituency. There are no patriots of an international institution as such. So it needs support, and not just monetary or financial support, but legitimacy. So that's what the project is interested in. Where does legitimacy come from? How is trust built, or, as often can happen, lost in international organizations? So many of the at least core members of United Nations associations are not just raising money and consciousness and so forth. They're actually fostering an emotional connection to these bodies. So I've looked at things like pen pal programs. So United Nations associations, they continued to do this. But in the 1950s and 60s, exactly, ran
astonished.
Massive pen pal programs to connect people all around the world, ostensibly to support the United Nations and so forth and so on. And some people are actually writing about that. But when you read some of the correspondence of these correspondence programs, most of the pen pals are writing, we shouldn't be surprised about this, but other things. So they're using this mechanism of a United Nations Association program to foster international connections and cooperation, which is the whole point of international institutions, but for their own purposes. United Nations associations created or sponsored things like UN cookbooks. So one wag has it that this was diplomacy with paprika, kind of fostering emotional connections. You know, the international institution is coming into the home, into, you know, the most intimate family places of the kitchen and so forth and so on. You can find in the archives United Nations Association napkins. So you can have a whole meal, you know, from your UN cookbook with your UN serviettes and so forth. But these same bodies could foster also negative emotional connections and responses, in this case to the UN, but to international organizations. So they became kind of magnets for people who had all kinds of negative emotional connections or attachments to international bodies. So one of the archival collections I've gone through is a whole box of crank letters that were sent to Wilson Woodside, who was the director of the Canadian United Nations Association in the 1950s. And they're full of all the type of sort of vitriol that you would expect from such crank letters. But much of the language of these letters is channeling conspiracy theories, sort of broader negative emotional responses that people had to the idea of internationalism as they see manifested in these bodies. So ideas of statelessness and so forth and so on in kind of more mainstream political terms, but also in, of course, the highly discriminatory and prejudicial sort of language of that type of thinking.
So really see quite strong reactions both sides, and very much this sense of belonging that comes out, or the need for a sense of belonging.
It's also worth noting that what Dan has spoken about includes a number of examples from United Nations associations, so groups that try to promote the work of the United Nations, but we can see various efforts to foster particular emotions and attitudes within the institutions or from within the institutions themselves. So both the League of Nations and various parts of the UN system, notably UNESCO, were very keen on promoting exchanges, and youth exchanges in particular, partly with the kind of sense that this might foster positive attitudes, a spirit of friendship and reconciliation. So emotions are quite crucial. And one of the colleagues who will speak at our conference, Ilaria Scaglia, has written a wonderful book about the emotions of internationalism, where she shows how emotions were actually quite important to the protagonists of the Geneva-based internationalism associated with the League of Nations in the interwar periods as well.
Exactly. And she sees around the League of Nations, she calls all of this civil society movements and things a sort of halo that operates in the margins and outside of it. I think we're getting a bit into the sort of nitty-gritty of what you find in the archive. So I wanted to talk a bit about your methodologies and so on. And Anne-Isabelle, you know, what sort of sources have been useful for you in tracing these different civil society activists and other people? What do you find in terms of emotions in there?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this, but like which source has not been useful is perhaps more the question. I mean, I use government archives. I've used League of Nations archives. I've used, as Dan was saying, the archives of the International Federation of League of Nations archives. But I would combine those with the personal papers, ideally. I mean, the letters from one person to another where they complain about somebody or are very happy with. I mean, that's generally the most valuable, because even if you're not looking at it from a viewpoint of emotions, it tells you something about what certain actors find important and what they don't find important. And in that sense, private papers are very relevant. But on the other hand, also like newspapers. In the Netherlands, all Dutch newspapers have been digitized, which is amazing if you want to find information, but also to get a sense about how people were seen by various groups in society. What were the emotional reactions to a certain actor? What were the emotional reactions to a certain idea in society? So in terms of, sources, I think you can look at any type of source and to use it, to like read it against or along the grain to find these emotions of either hope or distrust or frustration. And also, I mean, thinking also the connection between, for example, the League of Nations Secretariat and how they spoke about certain civil society organizations, which ones they liked, which ones they didn't like, and how they was talking about, yes, we actually shouldn't answer this person too much because otherwise they'll just keep going. And this person trying to assert themselves as a very professional actor, but not being seen that way, for example, and others, obviously, the other way around. But so I guess any kind of source can tell you something. And also, if it's sort of seems to have no emotion in it at all, if you know a bit about the person writing up this report or whatever it was, can also tell you something like why is there no emotion here? The absence of emotion also says something about what the state of mind was, of what was perceived to be the mode of operation.
It does. So Dan, tell us a little bit more, because it was so fascinating when you spoke about the United Nations associations. A couple of maybe another example of how you interpret these emotions and archival materials.
Yeah, it's challenging. So as Anne-Isabelle said, often, although sometimes we do, sort of have explicit emotional language and sources, especially, diplomatic sources and so forth. I mean, if diplomats express concern about an issue, that we've reached sort of, the
alarm.
That's right, a 5-alarm fire. So, the absence, like with a lot of other subjects, the absence of evidence is not necessarily, evidence that it's not there. So there are different ways that at least I've sort of been learning to try to do this. I mean, we can look for the language of emotion itself. So we can do that in sort of a more analog fashion as historians, deep reading, comparative analysis, and so forth. I don't do much of this myself, but digital historians draw on their own techniques, as do people in some of our neighboring social sciences, to do things like word mapping, to look at not just the frequency of language, so how often is emotional language used in these tens of thousands of conference reports or whatever, but things like the clustering of terms or expressions of emotion, and the connections between that type of language, those emotional reactions or evidence of emotional reactions, and the historical context. So in some ways, this is not different than how we do history in other ways. It's about kind of triangulating the actor, the context, and the particular example. But if we have evidence that certain types of responses are found in archival sources over and over and over again around particular types of events. So, some of those are sort of natural events, but others are created events. So UN Day, this is not a holiday that, of course, existed before the UN itself. but the practices of UN Day, I was reading some of this yesterday in the archives, are created or were created and modeled after lots of other celebrations in many, many different countries, commemorating other things. So they're mimicking the emotion of celebration through sort of emotives or kind of emotional speech acts and kind of physical embodiments. So flag raising, songs, all this type of stuff, which on the one hand can look a little earnest and sort of silly is not the right word, but, sort of a little forced. But on the other hand, people participate and have participated in these types of events openly and without any pretense. So we can sort of look for evidence in those ways. Historians also talk about ideas of emotional communities. Emotions are relational. To have an emotional reaction is often to share that emotion with other people. That's how we can read emotions and so forth. So as historians, we're well placed to identify those emotional communities and then to think about how and why they change. International organizations of course, are sites of internationalism, and as such, they are very good places to, in both the here and now and in the past, to study how people coming from different cultural and other backgrounds and communities and identity groups interact or sometimes misinterpret each other. So these are really interesting kind of historical sources to study not just how international organizations themselves work emotionally, but they can be used to study sort of emotional scripts more broadly.
And now we all want to go to the conference and listen in. But Daniel, you've written a paper with Sophie Scott-Brown on grassroots diplomacy that I desperately want to revisit. Tell us some of the challenges in tracing activism, and also what about, tell us more about the research on grassroots diplomacy, what it suggests about possibilities of change.
Yeah, thank you. So that paper was written by, as you say, by Sophie Scott-Brown, who's part of our GLOBE project, and myself. And it was published jointly by the British Academy and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as part of a wider program of discussion papers on the theme of global disorder. And it's freely available online. So plug for that. Grassroots diplomacy is an interesting phenomenon to study. That term basically describes efforts by different actors who operate outside formal diplomatic channels, who are not diplomats, who might see themselves as grassroots actors, to establish an alternative form of diplomacy. And it is something that we can particularly trace at moments of discontent with the established patterns of diplomacy. So in that sense, we can see particularly creative forms of grassroots diplomacy happening at moments of disorder, or where the established order doesn't really seem to fulfill the needs of many people. So we can observe various forms of grassroots diplomacy, for instance, by women's organizations and activists in the 1920s. We can see forms of activism emerging out of frustrations with Cold War politics, so peace activists staging their alternative international encounters in the late 50s and early 60s. And we can see efforts by humanitarians to respond to the insufficient nature of the new world order after the end of the Cold War, in terms of the inability of that new world order to react to humanitarian geographies. So in our discussion paper, we looked at these kinds of efforts, and you kind of were wondering about challenges in doing that. Now, often, of course, these kinds of efforts to stage counter summits, to organize alternative meetings and so on, they don't leave a permanent legacy. They don't create a new United Nations or something like that. So they're often quite ephemeral. And that raises questions about, so what? If these things didn't leave a permanent legacy, did they actually matter? And that really takes us to the heart of what it means to be a historian, because as a historian, one is always interested in contingency, in alternatives. So I think through the kind of attempts to imagine a different international system, different forms, the ways in which activists envisage different forms of international cooperation. We can also see what didn't quite work about the existing order. We can see or better understand some of the characteristics of international organizations as they were. And we can think about perhaps scenarios that might teach us something for the future. Now, one final point, because in our discussion paper, we start in the 1920s and we take things to the 1990s. And sometimes grassroots diplomacy could have actual consequences. And we note that in our discussion of the 1990s by looking at two international campaigns that ended up successfully, at least to some extent, because they did actually affect change. One of them was the campaign for the creation of an international criminal court, which was the result of efforts from different groups within civil society to push for an entity that would prosecute crimes against humanity. And of course, such an institution then with diplomatic support did actually get created. And the other example that we mention is the Jubilee 2000 campaign. So the campaign to wipe out the debt of countries in the global south that were carrying that debt with them for many decades. And this is something that, as part of the GLOBE project, is being studied by Richard Hussey, another member of our team, but it's something that we also tackled in our discussion paper. So in that sense, thinking about challenges and studying this, there's always a kind of risk as a historian of internationalism to either adopt the perspective of the actors that we study too much. And that means that, there's the risk of writing hagiographical accounts of these campaigns. And that's not what we want to do. But then on the other hand, there's also the risk of thinking about internationalism in too gloomy a way. And actually, our perspective is an optimistic one to say, well, actually, when we think about history over the longue durée, we see a lot of really terrible situations, moments when the established order collapsed or where the established order was very repressive and brutal. But amidst all of this, we can also see efforts to make a difference. And that makes it fascinating as a historian to think about that tension and to study it.
It does. And it gives us hope, Daniel. Let's talk a bit more about the conferences, because the GLOBE project has had, I think, 3 international events or will have soon. The first one, if I understood rightly, was in Canada. Dan, would you like to say a little bit about outcomes that you found particularly important from that event?
Yes, so we convened the first conference of the project, I guess a year or so ago now, in Waterloo in Canada. And the theme of that conference was reform and transformation of global governance bodies. So, institutions understood both as formal organizations, but also practices of governance and mobilization and so forth. So we had people talking about both international organizations and efforts to reform and or transform them, and about civil society organizations and the same. So many of the sort of research outcomes of that project clustered around, again, projects that were looking at historical actors interested in reforming international institutions. So we have people, for instance, writing about the participation of Haitian delegates to the League of Nations Mandates Commission and then subsequently the UN Trusteeship Council. So one might think, well, these are institutions that in many ways were running counter to the interests of people in the colonial and then global South, colonial world and then the global South. But here we have examples of people from the global South. So Haiti, depending on how we look, sort of count, are the world's first decolonized state, putting aside the United States, but going all the way back to the very beginning of the 19th century. So here we have an example of a long-standing independent state in the global South sending delegates to institutions that are explicitly colonial bodies, seeking to somehow have a say in those bodies. Whereas on the other hand, we have had examples of research projects, including from Sophie Scott Brown, that were looking at historical actors that wanted to transfer transform. So international institutions and organizations. So radicals. So she was interested in anti-nuclear protests in the 1960s, vis-a-vis French testing in the Sahara, and the idea that for some of the protesters, the United Nations was simply not up to the task. This is not a body that was equipped to deal with this particular case, but more broadly, challenges coming from the global south.
I think Anne-Isabelle also contributed to that particular conference and has an article in the collection that will result from this event, right?
Yes, it's on the Council of Europe, and it's a little bit along the lines of what you were describing with Haiti, in the sense that I look at African delegates who were members of the Consultative Assembly of the Council of Europe. When we think about the Council of Europe, we think of Europeans, and I mean, everybody's forgiven to think that, but when it was founded, there were African parliamentarians in the French Parliament who represented the African territories or the French territories in the Caribbean. And since representatives to the Consultative Assembly of the Council of Europe were representatives from the various parliaments, there were also French, African, and Caribbean parliamentarians at the Council of Europe. What I look at in this article is how they used this for their own purposes. So the most well-known politician that was a member there was Senghor, the future president of Senegal, and he was really a master at using somebody's language against them, in particular the French, but also the Europeans. And he was very skillful in also playing off the French against the Europeans. And the particular case that I focused on most is the European Convention on Human Rights, and how these African parliamentarians lobbied to get that extended to the colonies. Now, there is obviously a clear reason why most of the member states of the Council of Europe were not very happy to have this extended to their colonies, because in the colonies, they didn't necessarily respect human rights. However, it's interesting that these African parliamentarians and Caribbean parliamentarians did manage to convince the Consultative Assembly that this was a good idea, that otherwise you couldn't explain this to the world, particularly in a Cold War context where the Soviet Union would just exploit this and say, hey, so you're giving human rights to people in Europe, but not elsewhere? How is this European? How is this human rights, or is this European human rights? So that's, in a nutshell, what I'm looking at in this article that came out of the conference in Waterloo.
These are all fascinating topics. So, Daniel, there is another conference in Chicago on the dynamics of democratic backsliding. Would you just like to point out maybe one or two key points from there?
Yeah, so this conference was called the International Dynamics of Democratic Backsliding, and it was organized by our team members at the Chicago Center on Democracy, Susan Stokes, Kevin Cromash, and Simon Ballesteros. Democratic backsliding is a concept that usually gets studied within a national context, right? So processes of democratic erosion in particular countries. And what we were interested in with this conference is to think about the international dimension. And this, as we discussed at this event, could take different shapes. And we explored this from the perspective of political science, international relations, sociology, and history. So, first of all, democratic backsliders could take inspiration from one another. They could learn from one another. So, kind of the ways in which the independent judiciary was being dismantled in one country could give some cues to people who were busy doing something similar in other countries, or kind of vilifying the opposition in a particular way could give you lessons. So that is an international dimension in terms of thinking about the backsliders themselves. A second dimension is how international groups and organizations position themselves, and that might involve them trying to fight against democratic backsliding, kind of human rights NGOs and groups and so on. But sometimes also the backsliders themselves who are undermining democracy might often try to present these kinds of human rights organizations as foreign agents and try to attack the opposition by saying, well, actually, you're just the stooges of a foreign power and so on. So that's another international dynamic. And then thirdly, we've considered how these processes of democratic erosion also affect the work of international institutions, because what we can often see is that the very same political forces that are hostile to democracy at home or that are trying to limit the scope for democratic action at home are often also quite skeptical about international cooperation because they don't really like anything that curtails their power too much. And that includes domestic opposition, but it also includes international cooperation that raises questions about national sovereignty and so forth. So that's what we explored at this workshop in Chicago.
And so now this week, what do you hope that the conference will add to all of this fascinating research?
I think, first of all, we're looking forward to really many stimulating discussions that give us a clearer sense of the human history of international organizations. How do individual perceptions, perspectives, hopes, expectations, frustrations, fears, disappointments relate to this history? Because often, I think if you asked, probably not the people listening to this podcast because they're probably interested in international organizations, but I think if you ask many people, including many historians, they would think, well, maybe the history of international organizations is pretty dry. And my hope would be that as a result of this conference, we really get a sense of the lively nature of those histories, the human nature of those histories, and actually that there's a way of approaching institutions not as institutions, but actually as entities that are made up of people and that speak to people in different ways and that people respond to in different ways.
I think that's a lovely way to end this podcast. Thank you very much, Daniel, Dan, and Anne-Isabelle.
Thank you.
Thank you.